Hi folks, today we're talking about Chapter 5, Urban Development in the United States. So as we get into that though, we're going to sort of recapitulate, go back a little bit to what we talked about last week with the discussion question of, well, will Chick-fil-A come to your town? Essentially, will they come to your town? Will they come to your neighborhood? Will they come to your county? Sometimes these decisions about where to locate a business or businesses or franchise, often they can be based on or in uh, metropolitan or more regional kinds of considerations. And so that's one of the things that we've seen with the unveiling of the Chick-fil-A settlement strategy in Michigan. They've generally located and ensconced themselves in and around Metro Detroit, Lansing, and Grand Rapids. And that's probably for a couple of the reasons related to what we had talked about last week in Chapter 4 with urban development, that in a lot of respects, the potential for profit is really what is paramount in trying to designate a or choose a particular site for a business location or a business outpost. So whatever can potentially be generated there in the greatest possible measure, uh, those properties, those, if you will, locations that do provide a robust possibility of that are prioritized. And so that's one of the things that we typically see, especially with in a sense, a new kind of business coming. At least it's new for Michiganders, even though Chick-fil-A has been around for decades throughout the country, particularly in the South. So they're going to think about that. Where can we profit the most? What are the most profitable kinds of locations? And so with that, they're going to be looking very carefully at household income, per capita income, those kinds of things. Where do we tend to see those the highest throughout the state? Where do we see the highways crisscrossing and overlaying with those higher income areas? What other kinds of businesses are in the areas that, if you will, are up for consideration? Or what are the areas that tend to have a plethora of conditions that are conducive to a business like Chick-fil-A, so that there's really no ambiguity, that things aren't left to chance in terms of its ability to be successful. So if you look at where they're located, again, you've got a location or two in the Lansing area, the same for Grand Rapids. You've got a few around Metro Detroit in Wayne County, as well as in Oakland County. So with those things happening and with new locations coming, you have to sort of look at, okay, well, they're in Troy, for instance, or they're about to be in Livonia, for instance, or they're about to be, or they're in East Lansing. So those kinds of locations, again, are places where, again, profits can be stoked, and that's a big part of how they make those decisions. Whether or not they're fair, whether or not it, if you will, is a reflection of our taste for Chick-fil-A. Obviously, some regions may really want and thirst for that flavor more than others, but despite the intensity of that fervent support for the taste, again, profit matters, and so that's what we know and understand, particularly with looking at urban sociology and looking at a lot of the business aspects related to the discipline. All right, so we're going to be again talking about urban development. So as we talk about urban development in the United States, we need to be mindful of a few themes. First, as we begin, we need to keep in mind that the suburbs and suburbanization, that's the norm today, not the exception. About two-thirds of all U.S. citizens live in a suburb. So that is to say that they live in an urban area just outside or somewhat outside of a core central city. So you have your core central cities like, for instance, here in Michigan, like Detroit, Grand Rapids, Flint, Saginaw. So those are the core, if you will, and they've got, if you want to think of it this way, they've got spokes or satellites surrounding those cores that are their suburban counterparts. And so if you're looking at Flint as the core city, you've got Grand Blanc City and Township, you've got Flushing, if you will, as examples of those satellite suburban cities and locations and suburban towns. If you're looking at Detroit, you've got Livonia, you've got Chesterfield Township, you've got Macomb Township, you've got for instance, Clarkston as examples of those satellite ringing kinds of suburbs. If you're looking at Grand Rapids, you're looking at East Grand Rapids, for instance, as a good example of a suburb outside of the city of Grand Rapids. And so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at that package deal of the metropolitan area, say, for instance, metropolitan Grand Rapids, metropolitan Flint, metropolitan Detroit. Sometimes we refer to that as a SMSA, Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area. Again, it's just a fancy way to refer to the package deal of a core central city and its suburban counterparts. And we could say the same for Philadelphia, for Los Angeles, for Cleveland, for Chicago, and so on. So when we look at all 333 million US citizens, and there's roughly about that many of us now, again, roughly 200 or so million, if not a bit more than that, 200 or so million, live in a suburb or some suburban area outside of a major city. And so again, we're looking, if you're considering the major metros in this city, or rather in this country, be it Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, Houston, so Dallas, just to name a few. Again, but those are the largest. Typically, we're looking at in any given year. Again, you're looking at within each of those metros several million people that live within that sphere of influence, live within that standard metropolitan statistical area. So, for instance, Metro Detroit is home to about 4.3 million people. Metro Atlanta, you're looking at roughly 5.5 to 6 million people in Metro Atlanta. So again, those package deals, all of those, if you will, metropolitan regions, once we add all of those up, again, that's where you get, again, just about 2/3 of the US population living in and around those areas. So again, suburbanization is the norm. It's not the exception. It is what we do, although that has not always been the case. For the most part, we've seen that change significantly since the 1950s. So from the 1950s into the present day, if you will, so over that significant expanse of time, we've seen the shifting, if you will, from the concentration of folks in cities to, in a sense, the reverse, where the concentration of folks is in the suburbs. People are still in the core cities, obviously, the core cities of, again, Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, Flint, Philly, but again, not nearly to the extent that they were. So again, that's something to keep in mind. Also, race and class segregation and inequality have accompanied this process of suburbanization. We did indeed have racial segregation. We did have class segregation prior to this ushering in of suburbanization. But again, what has happened is in the ensuing suburbanization, we've seen a re-intensification. We've seen truly a hardening of the lines in terms of racial and class separation throughout our country, particularly as evidenced in its metropolitan regions. And so, with that in mind, also with the suburbs growing so much and dwarfing in many cases, if not most, the central cities that they surround, regional or metropolitan, that those statuses matter a lot more. So the status of the region, the status of Metro Detroit as a region, the status of Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties as a core central region, the status of Metro Atlanta, the status of Metro Dallas, Fort Worth as a region. That's what really matters in a lot of respects. There's often significant fluctuation over time. If we go back to, say, 1950 and look at what Detroit's population was then, what Chicago's population was then, what Philly's population was then. Detroit's population going back that far was at almost 2 million people. The same was true for Philadelphia. If we're looking at Chicago back then, 1950, 1960, you're looking at about 3.5 million people just in the city of Chicago's limits, not counting the suburbs. So some people might say, well, Chicago's not as big as it used to be, Philly's not as big as it used to be, Detroit's not as big as it used to be. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of those, if you will, folks who lived in the cities at that time, in earlier decades, prior decades, I should say, a lot of them, at least in the aggregate, shifted really to the suburbs. And so they may not live in the city of Detroit. They may not necessarily live in Flint. They may not necessarily live in Grand Rapids or Seattle, but in the aggregate, that urban population, having shifted to the suburbs, is still connected thematically, culturally, and certainly in terms of political economy to the core central city. And so that really matters quite a bit. And so for a while in urban sociology, but certainly in urban studies, period, people would often get hung up on how much cities, particularly in the north, had shrunk. And you really have to apply a different kind of calculus. You have to think about it in terms of, well, how stable ultimately has the region's population been? So if we look at metropolitan Detroit, it has had well over 4 million people since at very least the 1950s. And so quite frankly, we've been maintaining that same status, that same stability, albeit mostly outside of the Detroit city limits, right? So particularly in terms of investment and the potential for where businesses may invest in a metro region, or what they may consider to be pivotal about seeking a particular region for investment. Again, they're going to look at those regional, if you will, population numbers. They're going to say, okay, Wayne County has about 1.8 million people, Oakland County has about 1.2 million, Macomb County has about 850,000. So they're going to think about those things. And then they're also going to look at household income, per capita income, among other kinds of things, percent college degreed, those sorts of things for which they can make their decisions from. And so again, that'll matter a lot more to them. Again, the regional population as a total. Again, that package deal of the Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area, the MSA, what we call Metro Detroit, Chicagoland. So they're going to look at that package deal a lot more because, again, that's where they can really make their bread and butter. That's where they can really make their money. And that's ultimately truly the influence of that core central city. That in some ways the core central cities have even more influence in terms of the culture and the cultural characteristics of a metropolitan region. And so that's incredibly important. Another theme we have to keep in mind too are, and again, this is sort of a few themes and cross currents working together, deindustrialization. It's a fancy way of saying that we just don't, again, make as many things using heavy industries. And so most of you are going to be, as you complete your education, working in services, not working in manufacturing. You're not going to be making a discrete product. You're going to be working on discrete outcomes, providing some sort of outcome for someone in a service capacity. Our economy is incredibly service-based today. It was not always the case that we were so service-oriented. Again, as we look at especially the post-World War II period, again, technologies changed in addition to globalization, another theme becoming much, much more prominent, where the production process has been parceled out and it's incredibly decentralized. And so we don't need as many factories to create cars and tool and die makers. We don't need as many automobile manufacturer suppliers as much concentrated in and around Michigan, Metro Detroit, Metro Grand Rapids, and so forth. We just don't need as much of that because we've got the machine technologies in addition to other geographies that are far flung all around the world that allow for one car ultimately to be sustained. It can be sustained, one car, one truck, one vehicle, by a plethora of different plants, far-flung operations, part suppliers all around the globe that can make incredible quick changes on the fly based upon globalization, but also based upon technology. So the technologies have also allowed for us to parcel out more and more and more, in a sense, almost subcontracting more and more and more of the production process. So one vehicle, whatever car you may own, drive, have driven, been in, is really this incredible assembly of parts and of people and workers from all around the world that are creating this and making it happen. And so these forces, deindustrialization, globalization, technology, they matter so much because they have increasingly allowed for cities to decentralize. And so what we're looking at with that decentralization is we're looking really at the incredible robust growth of the suburbs at the expense of the core central cities based upon those trends. Again, a lower need, a lessening need for heavy industries, Often even prior to the 1950s, you would see in some cases in and around Metro Detroit, you'd see some factories had moved well outside of Detroit city limits even before the 1950s for a variety, a host of financial as well as social reasons. So with that happening, again, that along, you know, with that and other things we'll talk about soon, pulls people away from those core central cities and moves them more deeply into the burbs. And so we'll talk about more of how that occurred, particularly its nuts and bolts. One of the big things we've also seen too, another theme along with these others, is the theme of disinvestment. Generally, we've seen mass disinvestment in cities and core central cities. And so when we look at the regions, if we're looking at Metro Atlanta, Metro Los Angeles, if we're looking at Chicagoland, if we're looking at Metro Detroit, if we're looking at Metropolitan Flint, we're looking largely at the capital in those regions going overwhelmingly to the burbs. Sure, they may have corporate office parks, or I should say, they may have skyscrapers in downtown Los Angeles, in downtown Detroit, certainly in downtown Chicago. You've got these corporate titans that are located in these core central cities and downtowns, but the vast majority of the true investment and often corporate might is found well within the suburban ring of the vast majority of cities in this country. So that's where the investment tends to go. And so again, it kind of goes back to what we had said about Chick-fil-A. So although we do have one Chick-fil-A location in Detroit at DMC Hospital, so we do have that, but nevertheless, it isn't going to, there's no way that that one location will pale in comparison to the other ones that we see crop up in and around the metropolitan Detroit region per the plans that Chick-fil-A has for the region. And so again, the disinvestment in cities, in core city limits, these areas often, again, is aided and abetted by the seeking, if you will, of profit. And so that's the idea. Well, again, corporations, businesses want to make as much profit as they can, and so they often direct many, if not the vast majority of their resources and their allocation of those resources to suburban areas. And a lot of what happens as well is a lot of our state and local and federal level policy changes, procedures, and investments are also disproportionately directed towards the suburbs. And a lot of that we can see particularly in terms of highway construction, roads, bridges, those sorts of things. And so not that there's always a plethora of resources for that sort of activity, but the very few that we seem to be able to scrounge up and agree upon, we tend overwhelmingly to, as a society, direct towards the suburbs. So this is a way of, again, thinking about what has happened, really thinking about what has happened over the past 60 and 70 years, particularly since the 1950s, right? So again, back in 1950, 60% of the population in this country lived in the cities. And the suburbs, they were growing, they existed, but they only had about 40% of the population. And so now we're looking at in a sense, inverse of that particular set of dynamics, right? We also saw particularly that during this time that the core central cities, the downtowns themselves, became much more corporate oriented, much more of a reflection of the interests of powerful business leaders, executives, and so forth. So in Detroit's case, a lot has been made of this with respect to the rock financial empire of Dan Gilbert, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Much of what they've done has ultimately benefited downtown to great measure, but it's also restructured downtown Detroit in a way that definitely reflects the interests and the worldview of that one particular corporation. So, and again, socially, we talked about this, I hinted at this before as well. Overwhelmingly, our core cities, if we're looking at Flint City, the city limits, all that which is within the city limits of Flint, of Chicago, of Los Angeles, of Detroit, of Boston, overwhelmingly these central cities are predominantly non-white, with the highest concentrations of their residents being African American. Overwhelmingly, there are exceptions, particularly if you're looking at the Southwest, where we have a greater concentration of Latinx persons. Now, after the 1950s, a number of things happened. Again, that was right after the Second World War. There were great concerns that we would end up, like our European counterparts, that we would end up going into a huge, severe depression. And so the idea was there have to be efforts made to stimulate directly the economy and make sure that we don't devolve into some kind of true depression kind of experience. Again, the Great Depression was not so far away in folks' minds during this time, and so that's sort of what their thinking was, that things had to be done to prop up the economy and to make the economy work as robustly as it possibly could. So a few things happened again right after the World War II, the post-war period, if you will. Home ownership was stimulated. That was one of the big things that happened. And again, this was offered and directed at the interest of the federal government. So the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Affairs, the FHA and the VA, Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Affairs, the VA administration, they administered programs backing mortgages provided by banks and other lenders. So this was meant to stimulate growth in home ownership. The idea was, let's give particularly returning war vets and others that we deem eligible the ability to own their own homes in a way that will allow them to stimulate the economy, such that they would be paying a monthly payment for their mortgage in a way that might be the same or even lower than what they were paying in rent. So this again was a way of stimulating the economy, of stimulating large-scale spending, not only by consumers in terms of getting loans that were underwritten by ultimately the federal government, but also there were incentives provided to developers as well to go ahead and create these new home possibilities. And so the government also directly stimulated and provided incentives for developers to do so. Uh, Overwhelmingly, the suburban ring, the suburbs of Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Miami, overwhelmingly all across the country, the suburbs were chosen for this. The idea was, well, if in the case of what we saw with Europe, if war breaks out here, the idea is people will need to depopulate. They'll need to flee the cities. They'll need to find a way to be as safe as possible. It'll be safer for us to use more of what is available away from the core central cities. So again, most new homes were built in the suburbs during this period. So again, tax reductions and tax benefits were offered for home ownership as well at this time, where mortgage interest and property taxes, they were deducted from a homeowner's federal tax liability. We also had down payment assistance that was fairly well instituted at this time, or at least lower down payments became more of the norm and not the exception. So throughout much of the early part of the 1900s, much of the early part of the 20th century, if someone bought a home, they typically had to put down about 30% of the home's value in order to buy the home. So today, although people can, especially if they have equity from another property or home that they've owned, uh, people are often very, very less likely to put down amounts anywhere near 20% or 30%. They're much more likely to put down 5% or even far less than that. And so again, this low, if you will, low money down payment type thing, this sort of scenario made it more enticing for people to get uh, into a house and to get the loans that they ultimately saw as being desirable. Overwhelmingly, the government at this time and intentionally at this time said that those who were going to get these benefits ultimately would be whites. And so that was the idea. So these programs they had guidelines within the programs, guidelines within the mortgage lending programs in particular, and for home construction. They said in the guidelines that these occupants could not be from so-called inharmonious racial groups. And so overwhelmingly, we're looking at the best chance and opportunity for home ownership for everybody largely being missed, at least initially, by African Americans and Latinos. In particular, those were the groups that were directed as seen as inharmonious at the time. And again, so this was federal policy largely coming out at this time and saying that this was to be the case. Again, we talked about the builders, the federal government, the programs they enacted encouraged large scale building of subdivisions of these suburban neighborhoods. So those developers who were most equipped to do so, they were able to get, if you will, funding and backing by the federal government in order to do that. Now, we can't leave out the federal highway system, the national highway system. And again, we're looking at the Eisenhower administration being the initial true funder, convener, and provider of this sort of effort during the 1950s. So 90% of the highway system's funding came from the federal government. Another 10% was picked up by each state. This system largely was designed, again, for defense purposes, again, to enable people to flee the cities if we needed to during some kind of attack or assault on our soil. But it also, of course, had a way of routing people in and out of major cities across the country. And so these, of course, were built to be connected from one major city to another, but also connecting roads within major metro areas. And so what happens is this increasingly incentivizes people living more deeply in the burbs, especially with vehicles being much more widely used by the average person. Right? All right, going on. Now, there are a number of consequences that we have to talk about in terms of the suburbanization process. First of all, just about everything is suburbanized. Again, think about it. For a lot of you, your first encounter with a skyscraper, a tall building, was in the suburbs. Maybe you were in Southfield or Farmington Hills. And so maybe being there or in Troy, that's where you saw big city type stuff long before you actually got downtown to, let's say, for instance, go to uh, Ford Field or go to the Opera House or something like that. So yeah, you don't even need to go truly into a downtown to have that be the only way that you encounter some kind of skyscraper. Again, the vast majority of our major cities around the country have significant skyscraper, if you will, presence deep in the suburbs. And so that's one example, but a lot of our shopping, if we think about our big regional malls, particularly in Metro Detroit, you're looking at 12 Oaks in Novi, for instance. You're looking at Somerset Collection in Troy. And so when those malls, particularly Somerset, was built in the early to mid 70s, I mean, it was pretty isolated out there off 75 and Big Beaver Road. However, developers knew that, hey, everything is moving out here. Everyone is moving out here, so we'll be right where they are. So all of our retail, restaurants, theaters, a lot of our leisure, how we recreate, all these things have been overwhelmingly, essentially suburbanized. It's not that the core cities of Detroit, Chicago, Grand Rapids, and Los Angeles, it's not that they don't have these things. It's just that overwhelmingly, on a per capita basis at least, you have a much greater concentration of all of this stuff in the burbs. And of course, although you've got your skyscrapers in the suburbs, the biggest office presence in the burbs really are your office parks. And so a lot of those office parks that are sprawling, that are linked by ultimately parking lots, one parking lot to another, that sort of thing, those are overwhelmingly, incredibly a part of the American suburban landscape. And so a lot of this led to the term known as edge cities, coined by the journalist Joel Garreau 30 years ago. And so for Garreau, his sense was the edge cities were like suburbs on steroids. They had a mix of business, entertainment, and retail. They always had more jobs than residents, and they were always anchored by a mall and major highways. And so we're talking again about places like Novi, Troy, Farmington, Farmington Hills, Southfield. We're looking at those kinds of places. So much of Metro Detroit suburbs, particularly much of Oakland County, could be said to be these edge city collections. And so Auburn Hills is a good example of an edge city. So again, you're looking at that collision of the highways, Great Lakes Crossing, as well as Top Golf. Of course, we used to have the Palace there. That was another example of, if you will, the ability to be entertained. And so even though the Palace is not there and the Pistons play downtown with the Red Wings, nevertheless, you're still looking at Top Golf. You're still looking at Great Lakes Crossing. You're still looking at DTE just up the road in Clarkston being places where people can get entertained, have fun, find things to do in the suburbs without having to go to the core central city. And of course, a lot of folks, tens of thousands, work in edge cities. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. One thing Garreau talked about is that edge cities always have more jobs than people. So if you look at Troy, Michigan, for instance, that suburb, about 100, I think from what I understand, um, what I've heard is that about 170,000 or so people work within the city of Troy itself, even though Troy has about 85,000 residents. And so it's a good example of the edge city phenomenon. Now, some of this may change, of course, with a lot of what we're looking at now in terms of teleworking, telecommuting, particularly during the pandemic. But nevertheless, the true core profile is there. When we go to a place like Troy, when we go to a place like Shelby Township off Hall Road, things look different than what they look like in a major downtown, for instance, comparing those two suburbs, say, for instance, to Detroit itself. A little different. Things look different, very much like what Garreau talked about well before the current era. Again, a lot of his work on this he did during the mid to late 80s when he came out with the book Edge City. So we have with that too much more private space, much more privatization. So that's one of the big things that's emphasized as well. Consumption experiences are overwhelmingly evident and a big part of how the suburbs are structured and organized. And so malls, shopping centers are incredibly close to the highways and the major thoroughfares to facilitate shopping, to facilitate that private economic activity, that matters a lot more than what we might see in some sort of public kind of endeavor. Obviously, we still have parks, we still have other kinds of public facilities for the common good, but they are de-emphasized in this kind of environment. And of course, we've talked about the segregation, particularly of suburbs. Suburb to suburb, there can be incredible racial as well as incredible class segregation. If we go from one suburb to the next, there can be incredible differences in terms of average education of residents, just to name a few ways of looking at things. As you can imagine, as we've seen things move just about everything out to the burbs, with the rapid decline in manufacturing, with the loss of corporate presence in a lot of the core central cities, you lose money because you lose taxes. The taxes end up going to places like Troy, to places, for instance, deep in the burbs. And those particular places end up getting the tax benefits and the tax revenue. Um, Certainly manufacturing employment, we talked about that, how that moved, especially deeper into the burbs, sometimes more to the south in non-union areas, because also during the late 70s, early 80s, this was a time of unions, uh, the beginning of union decline. And so moving factories away from these central cities in the north and off into the south, if not out of the country, that was a way in many ways to circumvent union protections for workers. So what you end up finding is that in the city itself, as well as the burbs, service-based service sector employment grows quite a bit. And so again, accounting, marketing, advertising, public relations, we talked about that in terms of the global city phenomenon that Saskia Sassen talks about. So again, those services need to be there to coordinate a lot of the functions that we see in major cities, right? Now, one of the big things that also happens too is that we see polarization of incomes in most of our major cities. We tend to see a smaller group of people who are fairly wealthy and they within that may be wealthy, middle class, upper middle class. We have a small group of those people in most major cities relative to greater concentrations of the working class and the poor. And so some of this also reflects gentrification as well, where certain areas are much more, if you will, up and coming, much more developing, and in so doing, they price out others. So there's some discussion of whether or not this is happening in certain areas in Detroit right now. Certain hot areas like Corktown or, for instance, the West Village, those are incredibly hot real estate markets now, and people are starting to ask those questions. Well, can the average person live in these areas? So, in some of the redevelopment projects that you'll see in and around cities like Detroit, there are ordinances wherein if a developer comes in and redevelops, if they take some kind of tax break or some sort of rebate program, they have to do a what is known as community benefits type of arrangement where they will set aside certain amounts of the housing to be for those who are low and moderate income for the region. So that's something that we've seen the Detroit City Council do to some effect, and we'll have to see the long term, over the long term, how effective that is in reining in some of this sort of gentrification where the gentry, those who are affluent, are thought at very least to be replacing those or pushing out those who are poor.